Never in my life have I ever stopped with "in the days of Herod." Never. Do you remember when you first, you're not going to remember this, but we talked about who Herod was? And
Yeah.
it was eye-opening. And all I thought about was, when you hear Herod, what do you think versus what I think? When I think of Herod, it didn't really mean much to me when I was reading this for years and years and
Yeah.
years. But when we do language, history, and context, this verse, if you don't know who Herod is, you don't understand why or what's happening.
Look, and this could be the reason that this is where Rabbi Soloveitchik decided to talk about the anti-Semitism that some people derive from the New Testament and then run with it. Because Herod, the first connotation a Jew has when he hears Herod is,
Tell me.
oh, that guy who murdered, persecuted. I mean, I,
So slow down.
I don't want to compare the two. The best comparison I can give is talk to Russian people about Stalin.
Mm-hmm.
That's how Jews feel about Herod,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so this is an interesting thing. We're going to get to this, but there's something profound in verse 3 that the Christian understands, that the Jew understands something completely different.
That's what I want to hear. So when you hear Herod, again, when you hear "in the days of Herod," when you
so
think
Herod was an interesting figure.
Exactly.
His ancestor had been an Edomite.
Yep.
The Edomites had come into southern Judea during the 70 years that the Jews were in the Babylonian exile.
Mm-hmm.
And when the Jews came back under Zerubbabel, they never reconquered that area of southern Judea. And what do I mean by southern Judea? Hebron, Beersheba, all that area was occupied territory controlled by the Idumeans, who were the Edomites, the biblical Edomites. Then you had a series of wars of conquest by John Hyrcanus, followed by Aristobulus and Alexander Jannaeus, who we mentioned before. And during these wars of conquest, they expanded the area of Judea. Now, in the Torah, it talks about driving out the nations because they worship idols. But we actually see an example in Joshua where there was a Canaanite who didn't have to be driven out. And who was that? That was Rahab. She had a choice. Instead of being forced to leave the land, she could become an Israelite. And so these Hasmonean rulers and kings eventually, when they conquered these areas, they said to the local inhabitants, you can leave from our ancestral territory, from Galilee and from Idumea, or you could become Israelites. How do you become Israelites? Get circumcised and start following the laws of the Torah. And so the Idumeans were converted to Judaism. Now, in the history, it's described as they were forcibly converted to Judaism, although they were in some respect, right? But they had the option to leave. So Herod's ancestors were forcibly converted to Judaism, forcibly on some level, right? Like I said, they could have left, but in reality, they were kind of forced, and it never really took. So if you look at all the great buildings that Herod built, he built the temple to Augustus in Samaria and Sebastia. To this day, you can go, or at least when I was studying 20 years ago at the Institute of Archaeology at Hebrew University of Jerusalem on Mount Scopus, they have a statue of Augustus there. That was a statue of Augustus that was unearthed at Sebastia at the town of Shomron, which was renamed Sebastia, in the temple to Augustus. Augustus was treated as a god and worshipped as a god. Sacrifices were brought to him. And so, I think maybe some Christians have this idea that Herod was this great figure for the Jews. I think a lot of Christians know this isn't true, but some have this idea he was this great figure for the Jews. He rebuilt the temple and made it beautiful, and giant stones, some of which are still there to this day. But in reality, he did the same for the pagan temples. He built new pagan temples in Sebastia, in Caesarea. And so what is a Jewish king doing building all these pagan temples? This Jewish king is an Edomite who was forced to convert to Judaism and despised certainly his Jewish subjects. In the year 40 BC, Herod came to power, and he was almost immediately overthrown by a Jewish uprising. The Jewish uprising was backed by by Jews who had come from Parthia, from Babylonia, which was part of the Parthian Empire. And they said, look, if you overthrow Herod, we'll intervene and you won't be under Roman rule anymore. We'll give you a great degree of autonomy, just like we do the rabbis here in Babylonia. This is what the Persians told them, the Parthian Empire. And they were successful. They defeated him. He had to flee. He then goes to Rome. This is Herod. And in Rome, he says, look, the Jews will never accept me unless I'm a king.
That's right.
At that point, he wasn't a king. He was an ethnarch, that is the ruler of an ethnic group, of a nationality. So they made him king. And he comes back and he uses military force to reconquer the land. It takes him about 3 years, around 37 BC. He reconquers Israel. And then he begins a reign of terror. Why the reign of terror? The Jews never accepted him as king. Number one, in Deuteronomy, it says in chapter 17, if you choose a king, he will be one of your brethren. This man was an Edomite. He had no business being king. He wasn't from the line of Judah. He wasn't from the line of David. He was a false king. Mm-hmm. Now, there had been Hasmoneans who had been kings, mm-hmm. and they were resisted by a lot of people. The Hasmoneans were the Maccabees from the Hanukkah story. Mm-hmm. Originally, they were high priests, but later they installed themselves as king, beginning with Aristobulus or possibly with Yanai, Alexander Jannaeus. Around 104, 103, they proclaimed themselves kings. And there's a lot of people who say, wait a minute, you're a high priest from the line of Aaron. You can't be king. What kind of king are you? You're an illegal king.
Right.
And so some people accepted them, some didn't. Almost nobody accepted Herod. And so he had to use brute force to get the people to accept him. And the history of Herod, as told by Josephus, is one massacre after another massacre after another massacre. About 10 or 15 years ago, they discovered the tomb of Herod at Herodion, which is near Tekoa. You can actually see it from Mount Scopus in northern Jerusalem, but it's actually south of Jerusalem. It's this peak it's an artificial peak that sticks up. You can see it from Mount Scopus. Ehud Netzer, a professor at Hebrew University, who actually died in the excavations, he gave his life to find this. He fell while they were excavating this kind of like hill. He found the tomb of Herod, and he found the sarcophagus of Herod, which was this beautiful red marble sarcophagus. It was smashed into 1,000 pieces. Why was it smashed into 1,000 pieces? Because the people hated Herod so much that as soon as they got the opportunity during the Jewish revolt in 66 CE, they captured Herodion and smashed into as many pieces as they could his tomb, his grave, because they hated him so much. So the people hate Herod. So as soon as you hear in the time of King Herod, you're like, oh no, what else did he do?